Hey everyone, thanks for coming back to week 3. We're going to be covering Modern Analytic Group Theory. This is one of the most popular group theories, at least within AGPA, and has a lot of backing in the professional community and private practices, probably second to the interpersonal Yalom theory that most of us learn in school. So a lot to learn, and we'll get started into this section. Just to get an overview of this seminar, it's going to cover a little bit of the inception and the history of the theories, some core concepts, some differences between this approach and interpersonal group therapy, as well as talking about different interventions, traits by the leader, and some core change factors, as well trying to hold a social justice and anti-racist frame to infuse that throughout the content. So I'll try and be mindful of considerations and helping move us along in terms of incorporating some social cultural context. So the two primary texts that were used, the primary one is The Technique of Group Treatment by Louis Ormont. He has a lot of wonderful books and resources and articles, all kind of encapsulated in this one collection. And also started to read and haven't quite finished, but I think I've taken away some really good points so far already, by Women in Psychoanalysis, the paper of Lucy Holmes. That's something that was suggested last year to me. So I wanted to try and get some perspectives from a more feminist view within the psychoanalytic framework, since that's been one of the criticisms of it, at least early on. And it's really helpful. I'll try and, again, incorporate that in some of the thoughts and examples as we go along with considerations within that gender binary. And when we talk about actually modern analytic groups, if you want to think about what was a non-modern analytic group that actually looked like, the most traditional psychoanalytic group looked like a wheel with the center circle of the therapist in a swivel chair, while everyone laid on couches with their heads towards the therapist, almost like a wheel and like lines for that pike. So with everybody free associating just their thoughts out loud, not looking at each other, just kind of staring at the ceiling. So pretty strange, pretty out there and different. Don't really see that done a lot. Maybe it'll come back in style as we all get back in person. But that shifted towards a more Tavistock approach, where it was beyond did a kind of group as a whole approach within hospitals, and folks also kind of pioneered some of the group analytic work, which I think we'll be covering in the coming weeks. And then we kind of shifted towards the more modern analytic approach, where there was, a shift towards some of these modalities. Again, some of what I really want to focus on is that, and this speaks to me in terms of the need to modernize modern analytic a bit more, in terms of trying to hold on to this sociocultural transference and context. Because as I read Ormont's work and some of the other theorists and famous papers, there's not really a lot of identity characteristics beyond a male and female binary. And that's really limiting in terms of all the diversity factors that can be coming into play, in terms of the sociocultural expectations of individuals. And so again, I'll try to highlight that and some considerations coming from my own frame. And if you have any comments or thoughts, things that I missed or microaggressions that were made, then feel free to email me, and I'm happy to continue my growth in that as well. So I got this idea from someone who gave me some feedback in my cohort that said it's seeing an hour and 20-minute video was really discouraging. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds really discouraging. So I tried to make a little summary of the really, really brief highlights of a too long didn't watch list. So if I had to summarize Modern Analytic in a few minutes or less, the goal is to set up a clear contract with members, and that can vary, but essentially putting your spontaneous thoughts and feelings into the present moment authentically, and holding curiosity for yourselves, telling emotionally meaningful stories from your life, sharing time equally, and talking about what you're feeling and why you might be feeling it. as well as like speculating about other members in that. So really focused on the here and now in that. And so once you set up that contract and that becomes your foundation, then group is about studying the resistances to that contract. So it's a contract that you know is going to be broken like every other moment in the group. And your approach as a leader will be one of non-judgmental acceptance, responsive kindness, and sensitive empathy most of the time. There's a flexibility here that we'll get to later, but essentially when you're holding a frame in that group, you are going to be pretty warm and receptive to folks throughout that process until you come across certain resistances. One of the biggest contributions that Ormond talks about is bridging. And this again really gets us away from this idea of like doing individual while the group watches or having a dyad, just go at it in the space. And so you as a group leader can think of yourself kind of as a conductor where you're bridging in people who may have similar resistances, who may have similar identities or shared experiences or contrary experiences, so that you can make the group more dynamic in terms of the dialogue, conversations, wanting to increase the unique ways people connect with each other within the space, the unique ways in which they view each other in terms of the complexity of their emotional inner worlds. And that's kind of the ways in which you can gauge intervention's effectiveness within group. And there's all kinds of different ways to bridge people. Open-ended questions, like, Mary, what do you think about the dialogue that's going on between these two members? Or Jane, what is it that you think Peter's really avoiding speaking to emotionally in this moment? So trying to, again, not speak directly to yourself, to the other members, more so like bringing in people and being tactful about who you're bringing in and why. Like you might suggest this person ask a question because you know they identify on some of that past familial trauma of being oppressed or silenced. And so when you ask them, I'm curious what you imagine Steve is sitting with emotionally right now, then they'll be able to speculate and be like, oh, it's maybe this, which will not only potentially highlight a hidden emotional experience of Steve, but also give the member who started the bridge a way to express their inner world, because we're our own frame of reference. And so that's how things work. Reflect on your emotions in session constantly. So you're always looking at what is the feeling that I'm having right now and being really in touch with that. Any sensations in your body or things that may come up. Raise curiosity whether this is representative of emotions that other people in the group might be feeling. Like if this is something that's representative maybe of a past parental role with your clients, if you start to feel agitated, like you want to berate the client, and this like something about you and your own history, or is this something that maybe is representative of what the client is unconsciously doing to repeat this behavioral pattern? And again, it sounds malicious and a bit victim blaming, like when saying that, but I think it's more speaking to the idea of what Lacanian like psychoanalysis would call jouissance, which is like this tension and pleasure of like, I don't really like this pattern, like that I'm constantly feeling like nobody is listening to me, but it's familiar and known pain. And so that's easier to hold on to than the unknown pain of breaking that pattern. And again, mostly a subconscious process, not something that's choosing to be miserable. It's an adaptation to that past experience in the ways that you've adapted to all those within your family or other social cultural contexts. So also, like I mentioned before, being flexible and continuing to shift your affect and your approach and style to counter resistant behavior once trust is established, as well as focusing on different resistances that can play out in the space. So that could be living in the past, people's storytelling and narratives instead of speaking in the present, which is very safe, very muted. Can't really do anything about past events, kind of only have to agree and or like, you know, speak to different things. Living in the future, if you're thinking like, oh, I would like to have a relationship with you one day, instead of speaking to your present experience of like, I really admire you and I'm really drawn to you and I'm having like caring feelings for you right now. Outside the room, so you're talking about storytelling and narratives, things that have happened in your life. Resistance is to intimacy and leaning in to emotional contact, or anger, expression, and avoiding that and keeping everything safe. As well as you wanting to cultivate an observing ego, which I feel like is like mindfulness, basically, in members. You wanting people to be mindful of their emotions, their cognitions, and be able to mentalize and be curious about the transferences going on from them to other members, as well as what might make other members act to them this way. So it's kind of working towards depersonalizing the behaviors that other people have to one another within the group. And also managing as a group leader excessive or insufficient insulation. So if someone, if they're given any psychic pain or emotional pain, then they may have really insufficient insulation. And that's something you want to address and hold and take care of. Exceptions to this, like again, when I think about intergroup dialogues and we speak about white fragility, there is a lot of, not a lot of insulation with that. But I think that has to be balanced with both acknowledging the difficulty and pain that can experience, and holding them to being able to be curious around what can be grown from this, and get away from this perfectionistic attitude that you can never feel discomfort or sadness. And that's actually something that you can cultivate growth interpersonally in this moment. So like not overly protecting them for the sake of losing sight of the other people of color in the group that could just been microaggressed against in that way. As well as like managing people that have excessive insulation, which again, all adaptive, nothing wrong with any of these, in my mind, at least, in that, you know, although it may cut people off from communicating emotionally or being able to gain emotional experiences, this is like the benefit of saying, you know, within your family system or within the social cultural context, like as a Black woman, you have to hold yourself strong. You have to be not just good, not just like really smart, but like beyond smart and like perfect, to not play into any of these stereotypes that maybe you get as you navigate graduate school. And so you build up excessive insulation, a strong armor to, you know, if somebody says something that's belittling or cutting, that you wave that off and you move on and you push through, because again, lots of negative stereotypes and views towards women or women of color, like in terms of being able to express themselves authentically and emotionally, which is more on the cultural context and the way the system lets people down, as opposed to a shortcoming of the person. Okay, so if I had to be summarizing some of the differences between modern analytic and interpersonal group therapy, and there's clearly a lot of overlap, so don't take this as they're vastly different, but there is a strength, or at least a very strong pull, that emotions are prioritized over insight, like in modern analytic. So focusing on that as opposed to the facts that people are sharing in their narratives, insights, or shared history, really leaning into where the effectual experience is most potent, as that's kind of a force for change in this modality. Particularly interest is like what emotions are behind a behavior or act within the group, rather than highlighting that the feeling is why you acted that way. It's like, well, what kind of like connections are made to that feeling, and setting that, like I said, contract from before and examining the deviations from it. Ormond gives an example of a man telling a sexual dream about another woman in group. And yeah, this has certainly happened in different groups of mine too, more the opposite gender switch. But his kind of point in saying that is like, rather than giving some fancy interpretation about how smart you are and how much you can like read into dream work, what's more helpful is trying to be curious about what's this person feeling, what are they trying to convey to us right now, why are they using this symbolic reference as opposed to speaking to their emotions in the present moment towards that person. If they are attracted to them or drawn to them, why not just say that directly? And you know, the goal is to not really lean into that interpretation. Rather than that, it's better to empower the group to intervene, because the group is such a great tool, because it provides like a myriad and a multitude of references and transferences that could be tying into the web of that person's experience, and connecting their strings, like of their shared like life journeys with one another. So something that group has a huge advantage over something that you would do one-on-one with this person when expressing this dream. So the group, again, main agent of change in this, and what they kind of say, and what I would say about modern analytic is it is a very powerful modality, and it has the power and like the ability to provide a reparative experience of emotionally traumatic events within family, within social cultural contexts. And it can be very easy to recapitulate that past trauma if you're not cognizant of it. So I think in AGPA, they've been speaking a lot about how because of a lack of racial consciousness and ways that group leaders can be cognizant of their stimulus value and how that plays into interventions and dynamics, then it's easy to reinforce this trauma and then to neglect or not be able to hold the impact of what you do within that space towards others, rather focusing on intent or doing interpretations and other like things that are moving away from that raw affectual experience and hurt that can be caused in other members. So the group itself, though, kind of the purpose of it is to repeat the self-defeating patterns that occur in life, rather than, again, I guess it goes kind of similarly with this paradoxical theory of change, like Ormont will describe. We're not here to like dismiss the pattern or to say, I don't know, if you find it like problematic, and this is again very culturally based, so like keeping that in mind, like if you're thinking like, oh, this person's smiling while they're talking about something very sad and depressing is making it hard for me to understand the intensity of this experience for them, and so they should change that. I mean, that's not the point, right? Like we would want to encourage them and explore with them the purposefulness of that experience, be curious about how that represents that past familial experience, and to highlight the ways it impacts other people in the room, but not as a way of saying that this is your objective truth. Because what I think can happen in these groups is, because maybe a majority of them might be white identified, if we're using that as the frame of reference for, let's say, an international woman's experience from China, like then we're putting in these Eurocentric white ideals as far as like familial expectations and social context that I think the group leader has to be really cognizant of naming and highlighting, right? That this idea of it's okay for you to have that subjective like feeling of like, oh, I can't take people seriously with when they say something really sad and they smile. I just think that they're doing fine. But that doesn't mean the onus is on the person who's doing that to change, because that's been adaptive throughout their entire social cultural context. So this is about, in my mind, being able to accept and gain kind of a more observing ego towards the differences, right? Like we're not projecting that this person is the same as me, trying to see them as their own unique cultural and social being and be able to respect and honor that, which again, I think is something that takes real intentionality to highlight when we're falling into that pattern. So a lot of what we're doing in this space is trying to reinforce the immediacy and the here and now of relationships, talk about what you're feeling towards one another, and then to deal with those resistances as they come up. First you really want to like highlight them or let them kind of show clearly to the surface repeatedly that they're occurring. So you're not just taking one instance and saying like, oh, that's a resistance right there. But if it is a resistance, then it'll continue to happen over time. And that way you can kind of have that be highlighted to the group on multiple occasions. One of the things that I think in the college counseling center world that's really tough about this is there's a sense of urgency, at least in me, that it feels like I do need to like do something to raise that consciousness quickly, because we have an 8 to 12 week semester, and these modern analytic groups and the ways that they talk about them go on for years. So now having a private practice group that's a year old, which is still in infancy, I'm sure to some people out there, they would say like, oh, that's a sweet baby group. But I do think I've seen a lot of shifts and change in the dynamic, even within that year span, that highlights a more realistic version of what's what you can encapsulate in a short amount of time, which is a lot. You can do a lot of change in 8 to 12 weeks. So I don't want to have that be discouraging. I think there's a lot of potential in terms of raising consciousness towards how these resistances are both protective and limiting in terms of how people can make meaningful contact with one another in the space, while honoring, again, their sociocultural narratives that have led to that being the way that they need to be in this world. So when we talk about resistances, that can be both an individual like person or a subgroup of people, subset of people. And then how do they formally or informally break a rule, wanting them to recognize the resistance and confront it. And usually that means having them be able to tap into some emotional affect that they've been repressing towards themselves or towards the object of the leader. I would say actually more it's towards the leader, because most of the time the emotion, and for thinking about anger, tends to go towards the self and be self-attacking. And the goal, as we'll see with different interventions, is to help them externalize that object, like inside them. If they want to blame the parents, but they can't blame the parents growing up because culturally, so like in that family, it's not appropriate to do so, then we turn that on ourselves. And it's pretty normal. Aaron Black talks about that as a pretty standard way of emotional maturity, expression of anger. Then our goal is to say, like, well, how can we turn that anger towards the object that deserves it? And we as group leaders within a modern analytic frame want to mirror and be flexible enough to become that object for them so that they can have that experience and work through that resistance, be more authentic to their experience in that way. So when you're preparing clients for group, Armand talks about it from this idea of education, reassurance, and resistance. And he talks about it from a sense of like, you want to be sparing with your discretion, saying and arguing that the more information you give, the more misconceptions people may have as they go in. I think that I see on that level what he's speaking to, but also, informed consent is really important. And when we're setting up somebody like within the group, for me nowadays, I'll be really explicit about what's going to be like potentially talked about. I usually give a vignette of some scenario to help people understand the complexity and help them walk through like, what is the way in which I might ask you to focus on your emotional experience towards the other, towards yourself, to give them a really clear picture of that. And I find, at least for me, that that's been very helpful. Also highlighting this idea of isomorphy towards, that the ills and woes of society, racism, misogyny, homophobia, all of that's still going to take place in the group. I don't want it to. I'm not trying to purposefully do anything, but I, as a group leader, I'm going to bring that up. I might be curious about dynamics. If a white member is only talking to other white folks, I might be curious about what that means, represents. If a member is referring to like people that she struggles to connect with are American women, and I might be curious about, like, does American mean white? Like, how can we be more specific about these things? Or if somebody says something really jarring or pointed, like in terms of their admiration or physical sexual attraction towards a female member, I might highlight my like fear or discomfort in my body and wonder how that, if that could come across as objectifying towards other members. So I think it's important to recognize that there's a medical mistrust with certain identities because of a long history of experimentations and being, told that not told enough information about what they're doing and then being exploited for it. And for me, I really want to be clear that, like, yes, microaggressions almost certainly will happen, and I'm going to take an active stance towards it, as opposed to, let's just see what happens as it happens. So I think that that's an important thing to highlight as we're talking about preparing clients for group in a more modern sense of the world. It's good that you're also wanting to focus on reassurance. And I think the ways that I've been told is that that's highlighting and that clarity about the isomorphy of those things coming into group has been very reassuring, because as a white male, it's really good to be able to highlight that, hey, this is in my consciousness. I'm thinking about this. I'm going to be active in this. I'm not going to put the onus on you to be the one to talk about it either. Like, I'm going to try to, like, as best I can, to note those things curiously for us to explore. Or again, like I believe different people like Aziza Elsher-Platt, like might have said, like, or was it her? I forget. There's certain like instances in which like we can use different languages in the group to just highlight if a microaggression or a rupture has occurred, right? By implementing this like ouch or language, common language that people can see and take a step back towards being able to reflect on that process with one another. And then resistance exploration. I think this is really helpful if you just want to ask them what's your fear or hesitancy in entering group, and recognizing that often the fear is the reason that they would benefit from group. So being able to like talk through and process that with them. And in individual work, not taking no as an answer forever, like if it's no for now. When we're talking about group effectively, I think it's important to highlight how their current presenting problems really match up with how group can be a microcosm and recreate that scenario within the space. And that obviously gets better and easier for you to do the more that you learn about, view, or become a part of groups, so that you can talk about the manifestations of these interpersonal dynamics from the past family and how they may come into the room as a frame of reference for that. And yeah, normalizing the anxiety and challenges that come with that work. So what are we supposed to do? These are some examples of a contract. You can obviously change this and find something that works for you, but it's an essential cornerstone of whatever group you're going to run to have this, because this is what you're going to examine the resistances to. So if you say, telling me emotionally meaningful stories of your lives, as well as talk about your past, present, and future plans, something in Modern Analytic that seems somewhat intrusive, but I mean, like, I think it does provide a lot of fodder and exploration of resistance. So it's, I think, probably just because of my college counseling frame of reference, harder to like implement, but is the idea if somebody's planning a vacation or somebody's planning like things moving forward, that they consult the group or they talk about it in group before they enact it. So it becomes a very interesting way of the group maybe challenging members if they're, or Mount talks about somebody who's planning to move out of town and highlighting the resistance that they may play into a pattern of running away from their problems. As well, like in the contract, we're talking about wanting to speak spontaneously in the present moment with our thoughts, emotions, fantasies about what other people might think of us. Relationship associations, if somebody reminds you of someone else significant in your life or of a part of you. Urges that you might have. We're always wanting to talk about urges rather than act on them. So wanting to normalize this idea of like, I want to storm out and leave this room right now, and have that be something that people speak to but not act on, so that we can talk through that process and what built to that and the emotions surrounding that. And trying to normalize that seems very important, as well as bodily sensations that you experience. So I'm noticing like that there's also this comment about sharing an equal amount of talking time. And I think this is pretty funny because I've had a client who was very much like analytical and like, with everybody in the group, this is like leaving us all like 9 minutes a session, like equally split. And the point of this, the way that I've read it now, is that it's an equal share of total talking time over the scope of months, not every session. And so over the course of like 3 or 4 months, people should generally have the same amount of talking time throughout the sessions. You might have client-centric or dynamic duo or trio episodes, so to speak, but that there should be a cognizant mindset to that, so that when silent members continue to be absent from the dialogue, that the group gets activated as, this is an important part of the contract that we're ignoring by having this person stay silent session after session. Arrive punctually, pay your bills on time, group's confidence, desist from acting out, like I mentioned before, and all that, as well as hold curiosity about what you're feeling and why you or the other members might be acting in certain ways. And that why is a key component that I think I've ignored in the past, but it's really trying to cultivate this exploration of what this may represent from the past, whether that's past parental dynamics or past behaviors that they may have had as children, which is again something I think unique or like specific that modern analytic highlights. When we're talking about the contract, we're talking about wanting to study what happens, ask why, trace the origins of that, like breaking of the contract, bring its meaning and form to the group's attention and elicit what the members' reactions are to that breaking of the contract. So if that's like somebody doing a very analytical, cognitive overview of their lives and being into a lot of deep storytelling, then we'd want to be curious as to like what benefit are they getting from continuing to storytell and like go on and on. Where could that be from? If they were maybe neglected and starved in childhood, then they could be really like voracious to take up space within the group because they have never had that experience, or maybe society and culture as a specific kind of identity like has kind of told them that it's not okay for you to take up space, and then eliciting the reactions that people have to that. And my hope, I guess, like the difference in where I might view this is eliciting the members' reactions. It's very raw, and at least at first, there's not a focus on wanting to like shift that towards like compassion or acceptance. Although I think that can happen by understanding its origin, like for that. But they're really wanting to lean into people's authentic, effectual reactions first and foremost. How the group is a commitment to be open with what's inside and outside of someone's life. I mentioned that before. And then again, being very clear about name calling and other things being breaks of the contract. So traits of the embodied leader, like I mentioned before: non-judgmental acceptance, responsive kindness, sensitive empathy, most of the time, being flexible and shifting your behaviors and your style to match, to join, to counter the needs of an individual or group dynamic resistance. So they talk about joining a lot in terms of, if somebody's feeling really hopeless and sad, then the group leader might also take a sad and more morose tone or approach as they're talking to them and really matching that. Or if they're more irritated, then like matching that energy and that passion that they're displaying, kind of mirroring that in a way as a way for them to, if we self-attack and we mirror that same behavior, then the idea is that they can shift that self-anger towards the object that we are, which is a representation of them in this moment, because we're trying to join or mimic them in some ways. Really constantly reflecting as a leader on your subjective countertransference. And I think this is super helpful for all of us to do, because essentially it just means be mindful of your own biases and subconscious influences of society, of your identities, and how they may be influencing you in the group space. Now, for me, I noticed that, I'm tending to let the men be in the group and not giving them as much attention, and really challenging and pushing emotionally for women to be more assertive and aggressive, or owning their inner anger. Then I can be curious, is that something about myself and my values, where I think in the Lucy Holmes book, she really talks about how that's kind of an essential benefit to this process for women, is being able to excuse me, sorry, being able to express what you would call a negative feeling. I'm of the mind that there are no negative feelings, but the idea and that is the anger, right? Which in society has been labeled as negative, to her point. But it's the idea of saying well, if I can own the expression of that way, again, I'm not pushing that anger inward, then that's a way to free a woman from the tyranny of the world, the sociocultural context that's been pushed upon her, and saying that you are only acceptable if you keep this anger inward towards yourself and never express this to a man. So that's something that, again, can be meaningful and very objectively clear, in terms of what you're wanting to do and why I might have that countertransference towards encouraging or pushing different members, while also recognizing that subjectively, that might be something about my history or my relationship with my mother. So like if I had an instance with a member who tended to say that things were always great and they were always okay and they had a like jovial attitude, then I might be more pulled to like to diminish that or kind of pull that, because I'm like, that's what I get frustrated about with my like mother at times, this overly positive attitude, and I want to bring that into realism. But that may not be what the client needs and where they're at, and again, may not be sensitive to the social cultural context of their lives. So really being aware of that subjective countertransference is key to you being an effective therapist in this modality. And the idea of objective and subjective is pretty binary and pretty unrealistic, right? Like we're almost always going to have subjective countertransference. I'd say always, because we're always using ourselves as a frame of reference for life. But I think to varying degrees, that can be more objective countertransference that you can be curious with the group about. So the styles and personality can reflect very, very different expressions and approaches. I've seen different analytic leaders be very playful, very open and curious, or more stoic and reserved, and a lighter touch to things, not wanting to give anything that they're not first given by the clients. And so just again to say that this is not a rigid style, and it actually really requires people to be very flexible with whatever their naturalistic tendency is. So acting in is a form of acting out within the therapeutic setting, and that's essentially reenacting these past events in disguise within the group setting. So when we express different feelings like anger or outbursts without exploring them or speaking about them or not wanting to talk about them more, then that's part of the acting and behavior that we want to highlight. Like I'm one that says if a contract that says you never have to share anything you're not comfortable with, content-wise from your past. If somebody asks you about like, why don't you ever want to talk about your mother and what happened? But the minimum that I need is like, what emotion is holding you back from speaking to this? So again, we can get closer to that authentic experience, and then that allows a lot of avenues for the group to be curious and to explore what that emotion could mean, what that could represent, why this is so hard for someone to speak to. And you can bridge people based on those shared experiences. Also talks about highlighting a behavior that's strange or unnecessary. So he uses an example in the book about a person where every time sex is brought up, he just all of a sudden has to go to the bathroom. And after observing that pattern for several weeks, brings it to the group's attention, and they start to speculate as to why that might be. And that obviously in this example kind of goes back to his resistance or hesitancy or uncomfortability with talking about sex or intimacy with others. So when physical violence is threatened, we really need to act strongly as a group therapist to make sure that that doesn't take place. This is not the time to use psychobabbling, trying to gain insight into where this may be coming from, but more to like set that firm boundary so people aren't harmed in that space. Not something we worry about as much when we're online, but you know, as we continue with this. Yeah, and the act is to really just convert any desire to act into talking about the actions so you can work through that. We'll talk about that a bit more with all these things later. Resolving resistance. I really like this because Ormont really lays out like how do I know if an intervention I'm doing is working in the group? And he lays out kind of a clear guide of saying like, well, it could do a couple of things, and that's how you know it's effective. If it brings up new material, if it brings up different feelings in the group that weren't there presently, the group's been kind of sad, but now they're being pushed towards anger and passion and empowerment, and then they're more playful. If it's a change in attitude or an upsurge of interest in the group, like immediate moment, and then if it realigns the way members relate to one another. Like in recent groups, I've had members share an aspect of themselves where they were always complimented as somebody being pretty chill, pretty like down to earth kind of person. And then as they shared something about their history, which talked about the ways in which their past had made them be really passive so that they wouldn't get harmed, then that shifted the way that the group members viewed that behavior. It was no longer this pleasant chill, but it was something that was protective and coming from a place of deep anxiety. And so that again is like a helpful way of saying like, oh wow, the curiosity there and me asking that bridged question for members to speculate about what this behavior means really led to them uncovering this unique part of themselves in the group and changed their relationship to others. Ormond talks about the never-ending responsibility that we all have as therapists to take whatever's going on in the moment and to bring people into the sidelines of this group interplay, again with bridging as one of the key modalities or interventions in this. And it's not about what it means objectively, because there's no objective truth here, but what it says about other people and how they can relate to that experience from their own frame. So focusing on not honing in on a particular member's pattern and having them be like an identified patient while you shut out other members from that moment is really important. Being able to reinforce people's tendencies or behaviors is something that can be helpful in terms of highlighting the resistance, but you're obviously wanting to acknowledge and have a chorus of people be able to talk about the impact that it has for them so that they can see and honor again the adaptation and what it served, as well as how it's maybe limiting to them within their current relationships. If somebody in the group happens to represent somebody's partner, I've often had different dyads of folks identify with oh, you remind me. This is actually, this can be across gender lines, or it can be in same gendered relationships. So again, I think that's important because it's not a binary in that way. But people can really represent the parts of their partners and can use that as a way of really understanding the impact that their behaviors or their resistances, silence, shutting down, agitation, kind of externalizing blame, how that can have on others. But that's just a brief overview for that. So as we're focusing on the leader's role and how we resolve resistances to intimacy, this is kind of one of the biggest things, at least in the college counseling center world, that I notice is, we have 10 well-to-do, lovely college students in the room, and we talk throughout the entire semester, often without anybody acknowledging or being able to note, without real strong intentional pushes, that they may feel attracted to other people in the room. And I just find that an impossible thing, that out of 10 randomly put together people, that there wouldn't be certain people who would be physically, emotionally, sexually attracted to one another in that space. So there's considerations, again, for the social cultural context of the group. College campuses have rampant sexual assaults and can feel very unsafe. And obviously, like we said before, misogyny can very much continue within the group culture as it does in society. So I make it very clear that people, it's important for them to express that anger of being objectified if they feel that way by what happens within the space. But like I mentioned before with Ormond, him kind of creating this paradox of you set a contract so that you break it. He highlights two classes of resistances that are more verbal and attitudinal that we'll go into. And the stages that he speaks about are, I'm going to bring these resistances in, work to resolve the fears underlying these resistances, and then identify the early forms of intimacy still present, how this represents their pattern of coping with intimacy when they were younger. And oftentimes I'll just ask in the pre-group appointment, what's your relationship with intimacy? How was it modeled to you in early childhood by your parents? And then how does that reflect what it is today, as a way of, again, trying to highlight the there and then to here and now, and how a group will be examining how that comes up within the space. So these I find really helpful to be considerate of and very validating to read. Verbal resistances like fact seeking, when you're asking question after question after question, the people become definition finders or wordsmiths. And that's a way of really putting the onus on the other person, taking yourself out of any emotional expression and really continuing to throw that ball back at the other person to be more vulnerable, to be expressive, rather than owning your own feelings or connectedness in that. And if somebody has a question, I'll often say well, what is the emotion that's making you want to ask this question? And really getting at how does this relate to you, or kind of even batting it back at them and saying why don't you talk about your experience with that question before leading into them asking about it. Like, give your frame of reference for why this is important to you. Because again, sometimes when you're asking a question, what you're really asking for is like, oh, I feel this way, and it would be great, and it would make me feel so excited to connect with you, like over this, based on kind of what you said, I feel like we might connect on this. Fault finding, just like when someone says like, oh, I'm glad, thank you for giving me the admiration, but can you stop saying like, you know what I mean? Or, being so doubtful of yourself and apologizing every 2 seconds. Like it's that way of like, leaning into the intimacy and then pushing it back away. Fighting, which is, again, holding grudges. Being able to say like, well, where were you 2 weeks ago when this happened? Setting conditions for closeness that if you'd only said it in this way, then I would have been able to understand you. That would have been like more open to that. And also diverting in terms of like, Ormont uses the example of people that use humor, people that like, he had a client who often referred to a famous film scene that matched the intimacy of the moment, instead of leaning into that person within that moment. Attitudinal resistances, a little opposite to verbal, and he describes some of them as like self-absorption. So focusing more on your inner world, no mentalization for the other like person in that way, more focused on your symptoms, your concerns. Detaching, so it's being like aloof and stoic and colorless, expressionless, which again, really important for, as we're talking about this resistance, is to be curious about like, what is this resistance that this person's displaying, but also thinking about like, well, how is this maybe socially or culturally relevant, right? Like if somebody is detached and they're the only person of color within the group, then that like lack of safety and fear of being harmed again with racial trauma may be very prevalent. And when we talk about resistance, it acts like it's combative in a way where I think that's very protective, right? So just trying again to keep these frames in a more positive light as opposed to negativistic or combative, and wanting to purposefully be rude and to push themselves away from the group or intimacy. Dissatisfaction, nothing's good enough, always lacking something. This again has happened with some members of mine, and I'm thinking like a few months back of a person in my private practice group who's a Cuban woman who really highlighted this idea of nothing ever feeling like it was enough, and not ever feeling like the group was helping her. And that again was something that we wanted to be curious about, because there were really meaningful moments and moments where she was able to meaningfully connect with folks. But then there would like come back in this mind and this voice. I started to be curious about what that voice maybe represented for her. Like, was that a representation of this like criticality within her own cultural context? She was kind of open to sharing that attitude that no matter what you do, you need to do more, you need to supply more, you need to give more, and that you're never good enough was the motivation for like pushing yourself further in school and other aspects of her life. And that was being kind of like she was embodying her parents' voice to the group, kind of telling us that we were never good enough and never going to be able to satisfy her in that way. So once that insight was there was a shift in her being able to recognize the resistance. And again, it's like depersonalizing it, like, oh, I get that that voice is there and I see its origin, or I see where the string comes from. And now I don't have to take that as this is the objective fact of what's happening in this group, or the reality of the situation. Distrust, being suspicious of everyone's motive. Again, I think that can play into a lot of like intersectional identity characteristics, and important for you to be really honoring and bring cognizance to like, well, maybe with a bunch of white people in the room, that this member can like feel a little distrusting. Maybe it's okay, like right now, right? Like, why would we expect something different in this space? And again, I say that from a place of wanting to posit it as a curiosity, not as like, I know exactly what's going on. As the white person, clearly I have an insight as to everyone's inner world. But we're wanting to create that culture of inquiry where we can speculate and normalize that this is a topic that can be brought into the room, and these identities are a part of our interpersonal dynamics. Like that social cultural transference is there, whether we acknowledge it or not. And lastly is complying. It's like doing the right thing, but having a lack of spirit behind it, which feels like you're kind of doing things for the sake of the group contract, but not really putting your heart and soul into it. So working through these character resistances, again, the goal is to kind of mobilize the group as many angles in which like members can be curious and interested as to what the purposefulness of this behavior is, or the impact that it has on them, how it relates to their own experiences, highlight the behaviors, cis negativistic like kind of view, manipulativeness, narcissistic side, and its emotional gain. Because again, like I think the manipulativeness is because there's a need that's not being met, right? And so trying to word that and speak to that in a way that I think holds compassion can be really meaningful in that, while also recognizing the choice points, like, and allowing people to keep their resistances, their adaptations as they are, because it is purposeful, but highlighting the idea of flexibility and choice that they're making in this moment. Because if a lot of these resistances and adaptations that we're talking about are subconscious or from Oedipal or pre-Oedipal stages, then by raising our consciousness of them, their origins, their purpose, it allows us to get a lot more choice or control to say, like, do I want to lean into this? Is this necessary? And start to question that from a more observing, mindful ego point of view. Pre-Oedipal's resistances are something that I think is pretty fascinating from this lens. They talk about Oedipal resistances being like, the verbal resistances and things that can manifest from the ages of 2 to 6 and be recreated in the present adult groups. But the pre-Oedipal would be like before 2. And so they talk about that as requiring different emotional, symbolic, or joining interventions to address them. Emotional just being like through verbal interchanges in the group, people may resolve that. Symbolic meaning like if they were underfed and neglected as a child, then potentially feeding them by giving them attention and certain words of affirmations can be really meaningful. Or the last one, which is by far the one that I think requires the most tact, intentionality, is siding and joining, just joining in the resistance by mirroring their affect. And there's various degrees that we'll kind of talk about in a second. But it's not pleasant to join a resistance, of a pre-Oedipal resistance. And the way Ormont describes like what's a pre-Oedipal resistance look like is something in which, and I've seen this in a few clients of mine, where there's a very strong, concrete, negativistic view of oneself, and the amount of self-deprecation and self-attack is enormous and almost immovable, like by nature. In that despite the compassion and love and connectedness that they can get from one another, there's this core belief of like, I am broken, or why can't we just move on? Nothing that I say matters, and very, very rigid and very sad, because again, you can see that this is something that's just so core to the programming at this point for the person that it's really hard to think of this as anything but the objective truth of the world and everyone's world around them. So with that, it's important to think about, like, again, how can I join them in mirroring maybe this behavior or this affect so that they can externalize that self-hatred towards me. And people find this very uncomfortable because you become the target of rage and attack towards yourself. I imagine that, again, this is something that needs to be really done in terms of like recognizing your stimulus value, because I think as a white male, I represent a lot of privileged and majority identities that if I was to mirror or to try and join with somebody who's like maybe been in an oppressed identity, like as let's say a Black male, then the rage and the anger, again, it's like not only from maybe some of the parental like pieces, but I'd like to think of the other parent as, again, that sociocultural context and racial trauma that can also be exerted at myself. And considering a lot of white folks are very blind to like playing into white supremacy or kind of minimizing or doing microaggressions towards others. They may not, there has to be a lot of trust, like to really build up this idea that, you're cognizant and trustworthy. And if you're doing something that feels hurtful, or you're kind of playing into this frustrating affect or experience, that they have this core belief that you're doing this for the good of themselves or the group. So they hold on to that like pureness view. So again, not to be taken lightly from this. But also they say not to explain joining until the members can verbalize their aggression, because they don't want it to be seen as like a trick or a manipulation of tactic by the leader. And it also should be really genuine to your emotion, like in the group. So you shouldn't just force it like in that way. But once completed, you can kind of shift towards back to your normal non-judgmental, responsive, empathic kindness. And try and explain some of these pre-oedipal joining behaviors that you can do. An extension would be to outdo the ridiculous behavior. And so, the idea of when the group members will say something like, oh, we should, change the time to be more convenient at, 10 o'clock at night to start, then you might like outdo them by saying like, no, actually we should like change it to 4 a.m. And these are all the reasons why. Like clearly this makes the most sense. And that as a way of like pushing back on their insistence to control or to kind of force their views or control of others, but highlighting like what that feels like when it's done back to them, so that they can turn that aggression like towards you in that way. Aligning with the behavior that someone is doing in that moment. So really just kind of continuing to agree with maybe somebody who's self-deprecating. And I guess you can kind of see this as a way of saying like, if they say, I just feel like really sorry and I feel like the worst, most disliked person in this group, to be like, you know what? You probably are the most disliked person. Wouldn't you say that they're the most disliked person in the room? And that again, like the goal, I think depending on your personality, like when I do that, it tends to be seen as joking, because like I think I have a lighter like mood to me, that people would not see me as really leaning into that anger or that shaming. But it does get people to push back and to say like, absolutely not, no, and to like kind of verbalize that affect against that self-critique that they're doing, and maybe pointing that anger at me for even insinuating that that could be a possibility. So abrasion, increasing the negative view of the analyst in that way. Negative joining, which is to agree with a maladaptive coping behavior that someone's doing. So if someone like is being silent in the group, and the group is, as the contract states, trying to encourage them and kind of talking to them to try and engage them in the dialogue, and you say, no, just let them be silent. You don't have to talk. Like as a way of, again, well, it's also like kind of more the sanction, like you're pushing against the contract that you set, and that can bring some frustration that why are you treating this person differently? That's not fair towards them. Reality like joining, which is discussing the facts of the situation, but shifting the blame again to yourself. So if they say like, I'm just doing a horrible job at, using this treatment well, and you're like, well, this treatment is not going well, but that's because it's like me doing a horrible job. I'm phoning it in, like and kind of highlighting that. Tutor joining, which sounded interesting. Armand used an example where it was in an adolescent group where people had all kinds of like laissez-faire clothing and styles, and so the therapist came with a really disjointed wardrobe and off-color patterns, and clients like laughed and chided, and he just took it in and was just like, oh, well, what do you think I should do differently? Like, and had them kind of tutor him like with his style and approach to dressing. And so week after week they became more and more engaged in like the better that he looked, which made them start to turn that view towards themselves and increase their intentionality and applying makeup, doing dresses, looking really cool. And it seemed like a really interesting and unique way of joining in that. So joining interventions can be vast and as varied as the creativity of the analyst, but hopefully that gives you some examples of it. And again, it often will mirror the response that members' parents gave them, like that critical parent being internalized, kind of like taking on that role, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's neglectful, maybe it's chastising and shaming. But the goal is to validate the defense that they're doing, like by recognizing it, again, its purposefulness, but then having them turn it and releasing that aggression towards you. Dispelling the fears of intimacy. 4 major fears that prevent people from reaching out is that impulsivity. This happens a lot in terms of if people are afraid to say something that's, just that I'm attracted to this person in the group because, oh, what if that like person is going to sleep with me, or what if I act on that urge and I start to like get closer to them in some way. And I often will talk about that with respect to our pre-group appointments and say, we talk about feelings and we don't act on them all the time, right? Like I'm sure there's people in life where you've said, oh my God, I'm so annoyed, I just want to punch that person in the face, and you haven't punched them in the face. And there's also been times in which you've probably been like, I'm really attracted to that person and I'm not going to ask them out to a date because of like my circumstances in life, because of how unrealistic that would be for where I am, or that I don't really know them or whatever. Like, but it's really important to be able to own that authentic experience, because when we deny that, then we have these hidden elements to us that we can't examine or explore in the group. Like if you're physically attracted to somebody in the group, they are gonna, potentially you're gonna be acting very differently to them compared to other members. And it's really helpful for us to be able to name that so that the group and you can be cognizant of how do you maybe lean in or lean away from these intimate moments with that member. And again, like try to diffuse the seriousness. Like it can be very playful, it can be lighthearted. It doesn't have to be like, I'm attracted to you, oh my God. So I try and diffuse the seriousness that, feeling something and speaking to a feeling and acting on a feeling is vastly different. And again, like the contract is meant so that we don't act out, and we're not here to date like in this, which is why we have confidentiality and no outside contact with members, and other aspects of the contract that I hadn't mentioned previously. But there's fear of abandonment, rejection, of course, fear of merging. And then for the fear of abandonment, again, like for the neurodiverse folks out there, like I think I know that rejection sensitivity is, although maybe not a specific diagnosis or part that's like part of the criteria for ADHD, definitely aligns with my self-examination and experience. And I think it's just important to recognize like where some of these fears can be generated from within like that space of being too much, losing relationships because you're too eager and excited and talking about your like pleasant feelings with somebody and having that really lead to them because their own traumas and histories being like pushed away. It can really like sit with you and be like, man, I cannot be too much for people. I need to stop, and I need to like really hold myself back from expressing authentically what's mine in this. Fear of merging, so that's like the opposite kind of problem in which like I'm afraid that I'll infuse with this person, I'll lose my sense of self and just be all about them and swept into their orbit. And the fear of vulnerability, that I'm afraid of being found wanting, that I'm not worthy of love or respect. And so for that, I'm going to be as closed off or minimal as possible. Like I can't be disappointed and let down if I never gave myself fully to this process to begin with, right? So again, adaptive in that way and very limiting. So working through those fears of intimacy, we're trying to help people understand, at least in my mind, the goal of this process is like an emotional exposure exercise. Like in a sense, we're kind of asking like, what's the emotion that you're fearing the most? Like in this, a sense of rejection, a sense of shame, a sense of like anger and owning that, or being close and loving with someone. And how can we lean into that? If it's dread, instead of being like, oh, I feel some dread, move on, go to a different person. Like, well, let's hold on. Let's see what dread feels like in you, introspectively in your body. How can we accept where this comes from, respect it, and lean into it, even taste the dread as it comes up. So again, that all serves the purpose of diminishing this idea that I can't handle dread. Dread means that I am not okay. And this is a way of like changing the narrative of that emotional experience. So never aligning fears with an easy suggestion, facile interpretation. So again, like we're trying to almost amplify at first this fear to lean into it, as opposed to people divert very quickly, easily all the time. Asking a question to another member when they're in a dialogue with someone else, like easy ways to like push themselves away from an intimate contact. And so being intentional to bring them back is really important if that's going to be the focus, is where is this emotion being most salient in the room. And also keeping in mind, if somebody feels overly activated, under-insulated, you may want to back down. You may want to come back and approach this with more lightheartedness, caution, humor, using a metaphor, analogy. You're like a kid who's about to go on a stage play. When you start to take center stage in this group, there's that nervousness, that pre-nervousness, making it lighter. Or sharing in that universality of fear, and really bridging other people to express their difficulties and being intimate or leading into fear, like in this. So engaging in nascent intimacy, again, this is like intimacy that's yet to blossom. And they talk about this in terms of like different expressions that this can take place as. Bonding, which is really this mother-child oneness, and mostly means that they're just connecting with the therapist and really resonating. They always speak to you instead of the other members. So again, simple technique. When they're talking about a member, but they're actually speaking to you and looking at you with eye contact, having them use the correct pronouns, like instead of, yeah, I feel really sad about what he said, and I feel like he's been through a lot, like saying like, can you talk to him? Can you say you? And like look at him as you're doing that. Yeah, I feel really sad about what you've gone through, again, instead of having that just be a you and them connection. Needing, if struck by a feeling of worthlessness, member becomes like assurance seeking and shuts down if that's not like reciprocated. And then giving, so incessant giving to others, interested in everyone else, but not necessarily having that be something that's reciprocated to them. So if it doesn't get reciprocated to them, then they get really upset, right? Because I've given you so much. Now, if I'm being selfish, or if I do something untowards and I'm not given full acceptance, then like, it wasn't about giving for the sake of authentic giving. It was giving with a like conditional, like this gives me a free out of jail card to act how I want in this space. So in cultivating this mature intimacy, we want to be able to create some emotional space for one another. And again, they talk about this as like an ideal, like this is what your ideal group that you're working towards is. Not that we ever reach this, but we're open with each other emotionally. We're unadorned, like just talking, and it's very simple. We don't have silent agendas. There's open taking of risks. There's powerful feelings that are present, even if they don't like state them out loud. You can feel them like with one another in the way that they hold themselves. And each intimate moment leads to the availability of another intimate moment, like kind of cascading that, as well as a freshness towards one another, life, and you're uncontaminated by these remnants of the past, which again, I don't think that we ever detach ourselves from the strings of the systems and society in the past that we've been influenced by, right? Those are the adaptations we have to live with. But I think I would see it more as like we're flexibly adjusting to our present experience, not taking the past as facts of our worlds, right? So working through the immediate resistances, three of the main ones that Ormont talks about are past, future, and outside of group. And these are kind of the crux of what I think is really meaningful contributions that Ormont has made, as well as bridging. But staying in the here and now is a big part of group process. And so when we talk about living in the past, the most successful groups are ones that can stay in the here and now, and it's very tough to do. Yalom describes it as like herding sheep into a pen with no door. You constantly have to shepherd them back in to that. And I think that, again, is true to form in this as well. So oftentimes, like if you're thinking about interventions that you want to do, asking yourself, if there's something in the past being talked about, how can I bring this into the room and make it present in this non-muted language of the past into this lively, immediate language of the present, right? So my parents ignored me, and start talking about how their parents always neglected them. And you asking like, well, who's ignoring you in the room right now? Or how's the group been ignoring you, like in that space? Like, so this might highlight the idea that like, when we talk about the past, we relate to the past, there's nothing we can really do about it other than like agree or maybe ask questions to speculate or do some problem solving and validating. So it really doesn't make any headway into people's problems, which is something I think we need to like educate our group members on, like why it's more important to be present rather than focusing on the past, which is unchangeable. like in that way. Now, that being said, you need some past for you to have context for what's happening in the present. So it's not an all or nothing, right? But maybe like a 70-30, 80-20, 80 being present. Really emotionally meaningful stories of the past and trying to like curate what that looks like for people. So also using the therapist as a frame of reference. So if you're, they're talking about childhood mistreatment, then you saying like, well, how have I been mistreating in this group? And I think that's really meaningful. Again, like when I talk about this with a woman who's talked about emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, manipulation by men, then I saying like, well, how have I manipulated you in this space and taken advantage of your like trust? And I think most of the time people are pretty like, you haven't, at least when they're first starting group. And so really leaning into that, like, no, I think I have actually. Like, so like, can you speculate on that? What moment could it have been where I really pushed you to do something you weren't comfortable with? Again, giving them that like permission and letting them lean into that present experience with you and how that's felt, how that feels in that moment, to own that as being something that's taken place or is taking place. Again, you'll be the target of sharp words, potentially anger coming at you. So you need to be undefensive, non-defensive and open, letting people own their factual experiences, not personalizing it yourself, using another person as a frame of reference, like who in the room is treating you as those in the past have, making an observation of a pattern in the past that's being played out. And again, this gets to this repetition compulsion and psychoanalytic work, which is the idea that you've been mistreated a certain way in life and you repeat that pattern, and that's that comfort of what's known in the pattern as opposed to like, I like it or I'm comfortable with it. So yeah, the idea of, if somebody tends to be neglected and we kind of notice that the group members aren't really giving them attention, then we want to say like, seems like you're all ignoring this member as far as I can see, like what's making everybody ignore her, and getting curious about like, if somebody says like, I have been kind of ignoring her, then okay, what did she do? What is it that like has made you turn to that? So really making that more of the present experience in the room. Living in the future is a bit different in that there's oftentimes it's more verbal in terms of the language, a subtler way of distancing yourself from something in the immediate. When you say like, I'd really love to have a relationship with you in the future, like sessions, I'd really like us to be closer, as opposed to, I want to be closer right now. Like, own that in the here and now, instead of thinking like, yeah, one day, maybe 2 months, 3 months, maybe we'll be close. But that'd be nice someday. And again, like if that's hiding this idea of like, I really love and I'm drawn to you right now and I want to be closer, then that's a good way of like really recently using it. Noticing that future talk tends to be a hedge on what's happening in the present, right? From now on, totally going to listen to you and totally going to be more cognizant of you, as opposed to like, I'm really sad that I've not listened to you, like in this, that I've neglected you again in this group. So things like I'm going to, I hope to, you can expect me to. Just again, noticing that one step removed from the present experience. And then living outside the group, again, discussing your outside lives as opposed to relationships with one another in the room. So asking yourself these questions can be really helpful. Does this content, like that the person sharing, flesh out the person's experience in the group? Does it amplify some understanding, or is it a resistance from being present? And I think, it can be something that like I noticed with different cultures and people from different backgrounds, where I may think of this as living outside the group, but I don't realize how meaningful of a story this is until like I get the context from them. So again, really being highlighting like, what do you value as fleshing out the person's experience, and how could that be different from this sociocultural norm that the person has, right? Trying not to take yours as the one true way of being able to flesh out someone's experience in the group, or amplifying understanding for somebody. But storytelling at length about the past really resists anybody from interjecting. So I'll often make it a norm that I can interject and say like, this is really meaningful and helpful, and I want to pause and give people a chance to speak to their reactions and emotions like thus far with you, to be present with you, not to just watch a soap opera for 20 minutes and then speak to what happens afterward, because then at that point there's so much content and then we're all talking about things that were spoken to 10 or 15 minutes ago, which is very, I mean, even though it's close to the present, it's not really present anymore, kind of past it in that way. So again, very slanted details from the person telling the stories. Critical elements are always going to be absent. It's really going to lead to advice giving, which is not helpful. And like he says, you can really basically just sympathize, provide some counsel or support, or just speculate with people and cognitively. So trying to say like, well, is there someone in here who's hurt you like that? And really pushing against the resistance that, no, everyone's great. It's like, well, like, let's imagine if someone were to treat you in the same way, who would it be? And how would they do it? Like, let's be curious and speculate. I like to give people permission to fantasize. And, you know, they say, I don't know. I'm like, I give you permission not to know, but just go with what feels right for you, who you think would be most likely to insult you or cause you harm or to cast you out of this group. And then asking the crowd also, like if somebody says that she's always been seduced by men, like then being like, well, has anybody seen evidence of the men in here trying to seduce her? Like, what does that look like in here? Like, and this has been helpful, I guess, in some of my private practice groups where people have highlighted this tendency that certain men would circle around particular women in the group and would always divert attention to a specific woman, even when the other women spoke. And so we kind of were able to highlight some of the attraction and, you know, desire to stay with one woman, and kind of how that leads into, again, this maybe misogynistic or objectifying view of her or of others of not being worthwhile because they weren't as traditionally attractive or what have you in that. So all these things are said from a space of subjectivity and curiosity around what can be occurring and how these strings of the systems that we've navigated can pull at us, rather than a hard set objective fact of this is it, definitively, this is what happened. And I think when you read Ormond and other books, there's a finality to it that can be misleading, because I would think that most people who do interpretations or kind of reflect on what's happened in the group, you always know that you're ever only getting part of the picture, and you can't possibly conceive or write about all the strings that could be attached to this adaptation or resistance behavior. So just trying to open that consciousness more so to those elements, as opposed to thinking like, I've got it figured out and this is the one thing. Again, this idea of amplifying resistances is something where if someone's stuck in that pre-oedipal phase or others, then you may want to amplify what the resistance is. Starving the pattern, Ormond again says to use this very sparingly and very intentionally. But if a client interrupts to derail a conversation, you might look at them at the leader, pause silently, and then go back to the other members by kind of doing something that's pointedly like harsh. And again, like the way that he kind of describes it is, you know, some people might see this as masochistic, or, you know, say that it's inherently rude or harmful. But I would say it's, you know, it is meant to induce those feelings, but it's not masochistic because the intent's not masochistic. And so this is kind of one of the elements I'm talking about, where like, well, we're trying to be more from a social justice or anti-racist frame of mind, then actually intent really doesn't matter. Like the impact is what's important. And so if we recapitulate this like racial trauma dynamic, like in these groups, then it doesn't really matter that our impact was to elicit affect, because then we're not really being present and honoring like the subjective experiences of people's pain in that. I also think that there's this idea of really wanting to be intentional around the interventions that we use. And so when you do an intervention in the space and you take something that's formulaic and seems like, okay, well, I want to highlight this person in group who's a scapegoat, and highlight that the scapegoat has value and that they're a voice for the unspoken, and really protect them and insulate them, as we'll talk about in the next couple slides. That works well in a vacuum, but again, if the scapegoat is a white male and the person who's expressing the criticism is a Black woman who's been microaggressed against by this person multiple times, then if you follow that logic, you've really recapitulated that trauma, silencing the people of color, the woman, the Black woman in the group, and highlighted the fragility and like protected that fragility of the white male member, you know, kind of holding them up as this beacon of truth in the group that people are not acknowledging in themselves. while almost like unintentionally like putting the other person down and saying like your anger is a resistance to your own inner workings. It's very invalidating. And why that example stands out to me is because that was me. I was the white male in that example at my first institute several years ago at AGPA. And the leader was not cognizant of my fragility or recapitulating that dynamic. So something that I think it stands to me that the more that we think about these things in our groups, the sociocultural context, the more you realize that everything that we do is in that context, has that transference element to it. And being conscious of that is a very different way of approaching these different interventions. So reconstructing and asking the group what pattern they're recreating with their current behavior is another way to like highlight the resistances and what may be happening in the room. And oftentimes these, again, are more references to the way that their parents have maybe induced a pattern in them, or they may be recreating their parents' dynamic and having the group be them as the child in that way. I'd say that another like thing, and this is again types of countertransference. I don't know where this is quoted from, but I've heard this in a couple different spaces that about 80% of our emotions are not ours in the present moment experiences, that they could be things from the past, things from the future, or induced by other members into us, right? We're feeling what they feel through projective identification or recruitment in that way. So your countertransference is an incredible tool for yourself in these therapy sessions. Specifically your objective countertransference, which again, I think is based on your social cultural norm. And so my fear would be that we would just assume that the white like countertransference objectively is the objective countertransference for everyone. So being really cognizant of that as you're going into this, I don't think it's a binary, subjective and objective, right? It's something of a like a fluid measure where you're always going to have subjective countertransference, and you may have things that are more generalizable to like other people would experience this as well. But matched countertransference, the therapist feels as the client does, and then complementary countertransference is where the response of therapists to their roles in which the group members like cast them in. So this can be problematic because the therapist may try and defend themselves against the induced feelings, like it's not okay for me to feel this, if it's like attraction or anger or whatever. And then you try to, when you act on those induced feelings, as if they're your own, then you really take yourself out of that role of the leader or facilitator, and you become more of a participant in that. So objective countertransferences to resolve these resistances, the group analyst must clearly examine their own resistances and experience the feelings induced by the groups, recognize and resolve their own reluctance, like for those feelings, cultivate a tolerance for them. So again, doing your own group work, doing your own analysis or therapy or self-reflection, really helpful to increase your mindfulness of that. Temporarily identify with the clients, the various clients, highlighting the shared resistances and motives while flexing back to your therapist role, like I said, to provide that objectivity. And then after they conceptualize this chief resistance, trim away these defenses, point out what's used, explore why. And focusing on like the resistance work until you have this primary shared defense of the group, which everybody can easily observe and acknowledge. So this takes time and shouldn't be thought of as like a one session thing and like sequential moment of events, right? These can happen at various points, they can transgress. So just keeping that in mind. But you wanna, they kind of say this at the end, the analysts, it's the best way to confront the group through interpretation. Seems a bit counter to the idea of like trying to not gain into interpretation as like an objective interpretation. But I think, again, the goal is to hopefully have the group interpret subjectively what it means and to create meaning within themselves instead of it being just a solely you venture in that. So discovering your own countertransference, you may notice that the group is responding to you in a special and unusual way. Recognize that you're doing some kind of behavior mechanically, unthinking. So myself, I can imagine again that like, well, if I'm treating this person with a lot of care and support, and I'm treating other people in the group more pointedly or really trying to push them, like Lucy Holmes in her book talks about some of the things that she's worked towards is having men and women have more fluidity in their masculinity and femininity. And so like if you're a man, to think what it's like to be a woman and to be more woman-like, and for a woman to be more man-like. And I think that fluidity is something that's more modern approach to it. We're trying to break this like binary of like the either or with men and women as well. So they see there's a spectrum of non-binary representations in that and in that space. But I think that's part of what you may notice is like more female identified members for me, that I might push them more, and more male identified members I might have more like ease with. And so if the group starts to notice that I'm starting to act more mechanically in that way, then they're like, you always like treat the male members and you give them off the hook and don't focus on them, but you're always focusing on the women. And then if you try to deny that and you try and quit your behavior, you really can't, because it's just something subconscious that you like you're enacting from maybe a past transference in your life, in which like I very much identified with my mother as the caretaker and my father is being more distant. And so I take less interest like in cultivating that intimacy with men in the group, like without me being cognizant of that. And so it's something I need to be aware of, is I'll tend to favor the women and their needs over the men, and like not push them maybe as hard to grow in their vulnerability or anger expression. So by identifying my own countertransference, and that it allows me more freedom to say like, this is my tendency and how am I doing? How are these male identified folks in the room? Like, and my relationship to them, how much attention have I been lacking them, or how much have I been overly pushing like certain female members without being cognizant of their specific needs within this, you know, not just using that mechanical one size fits all approach. It's also something to consider is when you feel something and you ask members like, why do you all think that I'm treating the men with, you know, kind of abandonment, like I'm not really caring for them, then you might get all kinds of like feedback from them. They might say like, well, you don't think men are as important, or you're hiding some of your own feelings towards being rejected from men. And if it doesn't fit for you, those interpretations, which some could, and that could be helpful to acknowledge to the group that, you know, you're kind of reflecting openly and modeling that to them. But if they don't fit you, then again, they might be referencing their frame of mind, because we are our own frame of reference for the world. So being able to highlight that back to them can be really meaningful, and be curious about that with them. So bridging, can do a whole thing on bridging, but essentially strengthen emotional connections by developing connections where they didn't previously exist through different themes or identities or aspects of people. It's not enough to say like, you two are men, like connect over man things. It's not what we mean. But if there's a shared resistance, if they have some insight or some dynamics in their family and other aspects of their personality that mirror each other, that can be really meaningful. Say, hey, how do you think Jake think that Graham is feeling right now? Again, by doing that, you both get a sense of maybe what Graham thinks and is feeling like in this moment, because Jake is like fantasizing about it. But you also get a sense of into Jake's mind and how he might connect with Graham. And so if Graham agrees with that, then like you may be able to like circle back to Jake and reflect on how that also connects with his experience in that space. Directed questions, a good way of doing that, you know, in terms of like being a little more instigating about it. You could turn to another member and say like, are you aware of Mickey has been really hurt and injured by what you just said? And that may not actually be Mickey's experience, but it's great, because if he does say that, I don't feel injured at all, and you go, oh, okay. Like I took you as like looking down at the ground to mean you were injured, but like help me understand what was it that you were experiencing? You know, so the goal is to like say it, but be light in letting it go. Like you're not holding, like standing your ground on that interpretation, but as a way of like getting people emotionally involved in that like pointed way to be like, oh my God, I just injured him. I'm like, I need to pay attention to this and lean into this more. Question a member about an interaction taking place between two members, so that triangulating about what do you think's going on with these two dialogues? Like, how are they really feeling towards each other as they share back and forth about their families? Or using group members as specialized builders, bridge builders. So if somebody has like a knack for body language, or really, like I had members in the group who were staunch people that could really lean into the anger and affect, which they saw as a problem coming into group, but really was used as such a wonderful tool because they gave permission for people to speak to their anger towards society, towards their parents, towards the other group members, myself. And that is so meaningful to be able to have. And you can start to cultivate those unique skills and personalities of people. Like I would have a member who would absolutely vehemently defend other members against me. And, we would find out that that's kind of the way in which he wanted to be protected as a child earlier on in life as well, which was really meaningful for the group to see that behavior and also to experience that shield coming up in front of my probing or specific questions towards members. So when we talk about insulation barriers, we want to remember that insulation barriers are like psychic coating that we've all used to protect ourselves against like psychic injuries and stimuli. So if you have excessive insulation, you want to shake off comments as inconsequential. That's adaptive. Social, culturally, it's really important to be cognizant of why those barriers need to be there. As much as we could be open and free in this space, those systemic oppression forces within people's work environments or relationships or family dynamics can still be very real and apparent, and there might be a need for that at times. So it's more flexibility rather than changing or seeing it as problematic. Insufficient insulation is like, something hits you, it hits you to your core. It's something where it feels like you can shatter if anybody throws some insult or what you would be seen as a negative behavior. So really with that, again, it's that idea of you as a group leader being the shield and stepping in front of that and being like, you guys are saying that you're angry at him, but you know what? This is all actually about me. Like I have not cultivated a space that's safe enough for him to be present in this group. And that's really frustrating. It sounds like that you've noticed that I've really let this person down. So you make it again about it's not his personal feeling at all. This is absolutely me. So that you're kind of becoming that insulation that he's lacking. Whereas again, that excessive insulation, you're more being curious and trying to help them, in my mind, understand the purposefulness of the protection and the armor in that, and wanting to do that slowly over time to recognize and maybe bridge and connect with other people that have lesser insulation or maybe have hard insulation earlier in life, but have matured and had a more balanced approach for them in their lives later. It's not to say that they're going to follow the exact same trajectory developmentally by having less insulation because of various systemic factors, but it can be helpful for them to kind of see what a different way of being in the world could be, to experiment and open themselves up to that at times. Recognizing the purpose of it, to dampen anxiety. And so recognizing how these affects and these ways of being really play into the relationships within the group with other people. So cultivating the observing ego, again, that increasing your mindfulness, I believe, of yourself and what's going on from you as a separate part of you. So your feelings and your thoughts are not your facts, not your reality, and not being swayed by your emotions or history in this moment, but being curious and intentional and open. Again, the group serves to cultivate all kinds of different ego states because everybody's a different frame of reference for so many different diverse cultural experiences in the world. And so that can be really meaningful to be able to see the interconnectedness, experience yourself through the eyes of others. And really, again, like Lucy Holmes speaks to, being able to mentalize in a way how other people are and how you can be and embody, do have those parts of you in you as well. It's just you may be repressed in different ways to not be able to express those parts. Like as a woman, you may not be able to own your anger because of the way society has built things to consistently say that that is unprofessional or you're not worth listening to if you start to get tearful or what have you. But really trying to help normalize and increase that individuation with members through that observing ego. So help members see how they're affecting others, help them see how this effect is produced, help members see the self-injury states of others' behaviors, and help people modify the resistances to that. So being able to bridge other people into that to say, what's the point of him denying the way that he neglected Anna? And having people speculate reasons why it's important for them to push away from being criticized or feeling disappointment or feeling angry at someone or having someone feel angry at them. again, really trying to curate this to the emotional affect that's being avoided in the space. And trying to help people see or experiment with different ways of being, invitations, I would say, rather than commands. So if you were to voice your genuine feelings, like how would you say it to her? I've had somebody in groups say, like, I'm afraid of saying that I'm curious to someone else because I'm afraid of making them, like, I know me. And if I wasn't comfortable sharing something about my family, I wouldn't want someone to express curiosity and ask me. It'd make me really uncomfortable. And I don't want to make them uncomfortable. And so like saying something like, well, maybe, you trust their boundaries and their autonomy, and you don't come with an expectation that they're going to tell you, but you name your authentic emotion as I'm curious, I'm excited at the idea of knowing more about you, and let that be and see where that takes us. And so giving that permission or invitation, and again, like other people use cute like asides where they're like, and if you don't like that, that's fine. We can toss that out the window. You don't have to say that. Like, but being lighthearted about it to give them permission to try out a different way of being, that flexibility. The idea is to, again, fulfill these maturational needs, because if we have unmet needs in childhood development from parents or society, then we've had these emotional blocks. And so we're trying to bring insight to the pattern, to display it, to see how it's enacted and how we've had to adapt to it to get by in life. And now trying to bring more social learning and reciprocity so that we recognize what impact this has when we engage in specific behaviors, as well as I think having compassion for people and the way that they navigate things. Like if I, again, have a member who's autistic, like then I want them to be able to express themselves and to own the way that they approach emotions, the way that they approach stimulation is vastly different and is not bad and doesn't need to change. But it helps other members be cognizant of like, oh, when I interact with someone, I need to keep in mind that this person is bluntness, like that's a gift. That's the authenticness that he brings, where there isn't maybe as much of a filter for that socially expected norm. It doesn't have to be. That's not like the right way of being in the world. So silent members, again, the responsibility of the group to involve them in this process. You want to say, like, why are these people being neglected? Who's gaining by them being quiet? Like, and, focusing on what's the awareness that people have of themselves ignoring this specific silent member. What could it be speaking to? Do we recognize that we're losing valuable input by them? And I think, again, this goes with if a person's silent and they're like one of few diverse identities in the room, and needing to be cognizant and naming that as part of the process, right? That this could be that same experience. And I've had groups from a gender dynamic, with the male members always starting the group and always like digging into things for the first 20, 30 minutes before the women feel comfortable to speak up, and then really questioning like, what's the purposefulness of this, or how are the men like, in being comfortable and taking up all the space, just playing into the same misogynistic pattern and like sexist pattern that like theirs is the voice that's worth like being involved in, and they have no care or interest in the women until they decide to bring themselves in, rather than recognizing like you're losing a valuable voice in here by doing that. And yeah, so, and asking like what they'd like you to do if someone hasn't spoken throughout half the session. So not having it be the members' problem. Like I had a woman who was very actively like, doing a lot of work for the group, bridging people, talking to getting the conversation going. And she was so excited to share something that had happened meaningful in her life, like getting a new job. And it was just alive in her, like this excitement. And the group members kept being passive and quiet and putting it on her to keep the conversation going. And so in my fit of anger, like what I had done is played into my own misogyny as I see it, and started to highlight my frustration at the person talking, the woman who was talking, as opposed to trying to understand this like conspiracy that the group had and making her do all the work, and her getting into this role of like, I need to caretake for other people's needs and make it a success. And that's my sole responsibility, instead of being like, no, it's frustrating. I don't have to make something happen for here. As a woman, that's not something where I have to put all the burden on me in this. So again, really important to acknowledge the ruptures or ways in which we may play into these dynamics, and have it be a problem for the group, not the person in that. And with dealing with anger, often in modern analytics, the goal is to focus the anger towards you first, because that's the safest container, because you can handle it. You have the ego strength that other people don't. You have an advantage in that. And again, like not taking it as manipulative or hostile. Anger doesn't have to mean hatred. And again, I would say like anger is often a gift of intimacy because you're expressing some sadness, some embarrassment, some shame, some pain. If somebody's angry at you for doing a microaggression, then they're holding up a wound and saying like, here's a lifetime of scars and wounds, and you've just like poured some salt in it. And like, you know, whether it was intentional or not, it's hurting and it's burning. So how can I tend to that? How can I like honor the impact and like express my sadness for that shared suffering that we have, rather than tossing it away or minimizing their anger, or trying to like dilute their anger. You know, really trying to amplify them owning that experience. This, I need to hear this. This is important for me to really be with you in this moment. And you know, this anger to me, you're giving me a gift, and I need to learn like about the pain that this has caused you. I don't want to take this for granted because I care about you and I care about other members who will identify with you. And so like, I want to own the sadness that I'm feeling, but I really want to stay with you and speak about your impact, not make it about me in that. So making sure again that you recognize to manage your own feelings in this, and deciding on the appropriateness of interventions, because you want people to own their anger and you don't want it to be erratic and uncontrolled for members. So being able to manage that by having somebody like who's overly activated, potentially like noting like, you know, I really honor like all the anger and expression that you've been able to give. And I'm wondering like, what do you need right now? Do you want us to like take some space, have some other people respond to let things like down for a second, or do you want us to stay with you? Because I want to be here for your needs in this moment. Again, putting maybe some onus on them in that. And these are going to be very subjective based on the dynamics of what's going on in the group. But I think it can be helpful to stay with the needs of the member who's in that. And again, anger can be a spokesman for the group's resistance. So the discontented voice, like I was saying, for the scapegoat, like for that. So just being cognizant of how that can play into racial dynamics, not recapitulating that sense. But you want to stop attacks, verbal attacks, and that's very subjective too. So really analyzing the idea of what's an attack and what's not. Like I think rather than stopping attacks, it's just important to have a system where you can acknowledge the impact of it, because I'm not going to be one to say like, that wasn't an attack. Me as the white male knows exactly what an attack would be on you and your identity factors. Like that's like, if for a trans person, there's some comment that's made that, you know, feels transphobic and that feels like an attack on them, then I want to stay with them and honor and be curious about what that experience was like for them, rather than trying to dismiss it or, you know, trying to take it away, but trying to honor what that is so that we can see what an attack looks like and define what that means for the group member and for other group members, I think is really meaningful in that. And analyzing your rage rather than acting on it again and spewing it out, right? So lastly, I'll just say final thoughts. You want to put your feelings into words. You want your feelings to be expressed towards one another. You want the communication, emotional communication, to be progressive, not repeating the same themes or emotions, but having a dynamic, diverse array of relationships and connections, as well as emotional affect, pleasant, happy, sad, like playful, agitated, like all those things are great, like measures for that. Continually having people expose different aspects of themselves and different dimensions to their personalities and their individual experiences, culturally, socially, relate to one another's, and increasing ways that people both see and don't see how they relate to one another within the space, and managing the resistances for people's progressive emotional communication through this process. So thanks again, everybody, for bearing with that. All right.